Caitlin with the Fiction and Media Department here at the Northbrook Public Library, and we're really excited to have you all here for our John Hughes panel discussion. We've had a few different events over the years that celebrate John Hughes, because I'm sure as many of you know, he was from Northbrook, and a lot of his films were filmed in locations near here. And we like to host it in February because that is his birthday. He was born on February 18th, 1950, so yesterday would have been his 70th birthday if he was still around. So we like to hold it during this time just as a commemorative program for him. And so now we're going to be discussing his films and his legacy, what that means today, what it meant back then, and we have a really great panel put together of people who have expertise in different areas that we're going to be discussing topic-wise. So let us introduce you to the panel we have over here. So we have, first up, Veronica Areola, who is the director of Los Ganas at the University of Illinois at Chicago, and she was most recently the assistant director of the Center for Research on Women and Gender, as well as the director of their Women in Science and Engineering program. She is a nationally recognized expert on women in higher education and a women's rights advocate. And Veronica has brought visibility to women's and Latinx issues through writing that has been featured in the New York Times, USA Today, the Christian Science Monitor, Fitch Media, and the Women's Review of Books. And she is a regular guest on Vocalo's The Morning Amp, Council of Feminist Thought, and serves on the board of directors at Fitch Media. And she holds a bachelor's degree in biological sciences and a master's in public administration. And next up, yes. Round of applause, everyone. It's a very impressive bio. Next up, we do have Kevin Smock over here, who is the author. Smoker. I'm sorry. I thought I heard Smokler at one time. I had it right the first time in my head. All right, Kevin Smokler is the author of 3 books, including Brat Pack America, a love letter to 80s teen movies, and he's also the director of the documentary film Final Nation. He frequently speaks on topics concerning pop culture, storytelling, and technology. And he received his bachelor's degree in creative writing from John Hopkins University and a master's in American Studies from the University of Texas, Austin. And as a book critic and commentator, Kevin's writing has appeared in the San Francisco Chronicle, the Baltimore Sun, and on NPR. So thank you, Kevin. He's got fans in the audience tonight, too. And moving down the line, we have Heather Ashe, who started her writing career in television with Stargate, SG-1, and Glory Days. Her 1-hour original script, Square One, was chosen by the WGA's Written By magazine as a top 5 unproduced drama pilot, and was also a finalist in the script category of the 2013 Writer's Digest annual competition. She has had her short fiction published and is also an adjunct instructor of screenwriting at DePaul University. And she received her degree in radio, TV, and film communications from Northwestern University. So thank you, Heather. And at the end over here, we have Paul Booth, who is a professor of media and cinema studies in the College of Communication at DePaul University. And he received his PhD in communication and rhetoric from Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute and researches fandom, new media, games, technology, popular culture, and cultural studies. He teaches classes in media studies and popular culture, amongst others. And he is the author or editor of 10 books, and he is also the organizer of the annual DePaul Pop Culture Conference, at which fans and scholars come together to discuss popular cultural texts. Thank you, Paul, for being here. All right, so we'll start out. I will be asking the panelists a few questions, and we really just want to get a dialogue going between the 4 of you. And then we will turn it over to the audience if you guys have any questions for them as well. Feel free to bring those up in the second half of the program. So I'll start up here. I'll direct a question at one specific person, but that can just be a starting point. If anyone else wants to chime in on it, feel free to. So we will start with a question about popular culture for Paul. So it would have been difficult to be a teenager in the 1980s and not have seen at least one of John Hughes' films.
As a teenager in the 1980s, I can attest to that.
All right, good. So we know what we're talking about here. So why are these films still popular today, and in what other ways do you think they continue to impact today's pop culture?
That's a great question. So I think one of the reasons that films like John Hughes' teen films from the 80s kind of remain so popular today isn't necessarily why they were so popular in the 80s. I think in the 80s they were really reflecting a kind of cultural sense that a lot of teenagers had about what the world was like, and also what the world was going to be like when they grew up, and so it was kind of like showing them the future in some ways. But now I look at my students, and if we talk about the Breakfast Club or something like that, they look at it as this snapshot of the past, and this is what life was like before I was born. And in a lot of ways, it's really interesting because, and I'm sure we'll talk about this on the panel a lot. Sorry, I'm not holding this very close to my mouth. And we'll talk about this on the panel a lot, but times have really changed in 30 years, 40 years. Oh God. When these 18-year-old students that I teach are watching these movies, they look at them like historical relics. And in some ways, there are parts of his movies that are historically relics, and should be. And then there are parts of his movies that are really still relevant today. I've kind of rambled a bit now, but I think there's this sense that they're historical snapshots is why they're so popular today. And even if students are watching something, or young people today are watching something like Mean Girls, which, by the way, is now over a decade old, or Booksmart, which I know we're also thinking about talking about, a very recent teen movie, they're seeing threads back to kind of what John Hughes kind of started sewing back in the 80s. I'm a professor, I can keep rambling for the whole hour and a half, so if someone else wants to grab the mic, I'm happy to give it up.
Do you think, it's also nostalgia, I think. Keep in mind that the people who are in their 40s are the ones who are now running the shows and making the movies that you're watching. So for instance, Sex Education, highly recommend that Netflix show if you haven't seen it. You will see references to John Hughes popping up all over the place, because these were foundational films, I think, for our generation, because there weren't that many out there. So, it's near and dear to our hearts, like your favorite song on the radio when you were a teenager, and I think that's influencing our pop culture now, because those people are now making the pop culture, and they're, tipping their hat to their founder person.
Someone once asked me to explain what was so great about Janelle Monáe, and after fumbling a bit, I said, Janelle Monáe sounds like the past, present, and future all at the same time. John Hughes was able, I think most of it was conscious, but some of it wasn't, to feel like the past, present, and future all at the same time. John Hughes loved classic Hollywood movies. That's why Ferris Bueller is on the town, but with teenagers instead of sailors. And that's why most of the Molly Ringwald, why the structure of a female main character, a male love interest, and a sort of questionably sexual best friend is taken directly from the Rock Hudson, Doris Day, Tony Randall movies of the 1950s. So John Hughes was already pulling from the past when he made his movies about a certain period of time, and they were also wistful in a way that made them casts into the future. John Hughes movies were not based on realism because none of us have ever hijacked a German Day Founders Parade.
Speak for yourself.
But they were all dealing with a kind of idealism about what it meant to be younger, and it allowed you to dream into the future of what it meant to be younger. I was 13 when The Breakfast Club came out, so those kids were a bit old for me to relate to them. It was more where I thought I would be in 6 years. So that past, present, and future is a big reason why we're still with him.
And just to kind of add on to that, yes, you're 13 and you're these characters are a little too old for you to relate to, but I look at shows today like Sex Education, where these teenagers are played by 30-year-olds, and Riverdale, where the teenagers are played by 30-year-olds, and there's always something aspirational about looking at people that are older than you as being not necessarily role models, but doing the things that you always have wanted to do, or doing the things that you think you want to do. So I wonder if that's kind of part of that constant appeal as well.
I think so. So
I remember when my daughter she was 16 now, was a preteen and starting to get into high school shows, even like on Nickelodeon and Disney, and reading people saying, oh, these are just too old for 10-year-olds. But 10-year-olds want to aspire to be like high schoolers. So when you're in high school, exactly. I mean, when I was in high school, we did watch 90210, but then Melrose Place came out, and that was also, that was our aspiration.
All right, thank you. We'll turn the next question to Veronica to start. So in terms of modern audiences today, so Hughes films are considered timeless by many, and they still resonate with today's audiences. But looking back, how are these films viewed through a modern lens, especially concerning like gender, race, or sexuality?
Oh, okay, easy. So I was definitely really thinking about this the last couple of days, and the idea that he has changed our culture is a little complicated, considering that our culture is huge, and he doesn't really have any characters of color in his movies, and many of those who are very problematic, and I don't really know how much he has impacted like Black culture or any other culture than middle class white America culture. And definitely, I was talking with a friend about how I feel like a lot of his movies want to say a lot about, especially about women, especially with Molly Ringwald's characters. He wants to be feminist, but isn't willing to go that whole mile. He like gets right to the tip of it and then wimps out. He really wimps out in a lot of these films, and so it's really disappointing, especially to having rewatched a lot of the films recently.
I've always thought John Hughes was a little too loyal to his roots as a National Lampoon's writer when he was first coming up. So his epitome of what funny is throughout his career has always been like 11-year-old boy summer camp humor, and which has its place. Don't get me wrong, but it's not the work of a mature filmmaker, and that I think was one of his greatest weaknesses as a filmmaker, is the stuff that served him when he was early in his career, fresh off working for a place like National Lampoon, seems really beneath him and his talents as his career moved on, and as he addressed more important subjects than 16 Candles, which is really structured as a broad, silly comedy. An offensive one, too, but
yeah. But I think it's also that you were saying that he's loyal to his roots, but I think he's also loyal to his class class roots.
Yeah.
Like, so many of the movies do deal with class conflict, and if you really look at it, you're thinking, you can really read it into like, everyone's great, there shouldn't be class conflict, the rich kids should date the poor kids, and it doesn't matter which side of the tracks you live on, that kind of thing, but he doesn't go all the way.
No.
Because he still wants to be a cool kid. And
yeah, that's a good point.
And so he goes he keeps going up to these lines, and he's not willing to go all the way.
And you've addressed something, because I grew up lower middle class in the Midwest. The rich kids that were in these movies, and I never, I watched Ferris Bueller, that was amazing. But even going back and rewatching these things now, I never was a huge John Hughes fan, but I knew I was supposed to be, because that's what was available to us at the time, and it was like he was speaking for a generation, but I was not upper class, at all, but I also didn't identify with the supposed poor kids who were really, really poor. So it seems like kind of the middle class was a little bit left out. I know it was more aspirational, I think, this is what high school is supposed to be like if you go to one of those really nice towns. And the yard because when we moved here, we were actually, after I got married in California, we moved back here, and I'm like, I'm going to Chicago, I can have the Colonial with the really big yard. I was excited by this. I can't afford that. And it doesn't really exist, but I didn't even realize until we were going to do this movie, that's how it influenced me. It's this is what we're aspiring to be, money-wise, and Risky Business had that, and Adventures in Babysitting. I know these aren't John Hughes films, but these were the movies of our time, and those were like yeah, Chicago movies. And Oak Park in Adventures in Babysitting is so not Oak Park. We're like, that's not Oak Park at all. Look at that. But it's very much that idea of Chicago that I had embraced without even realizing it. And moving back now, I can look at this and go, oh wow, no. But it's this idea of Chicago for I think the rest of the world that was really interesting. This what is it? The fable of Chicago, what it was. But yeah, there was no real, like the class, there was upper class, and then there was the upper class imagination of what the other classes looked like. And I don't think he had the vocabulary, really, to be able to because he didn't, like, he was writing from what? He lived in Northbrook, he went downtown, he didn't know people. Like, he wouldn't have that, anything to draw from, I think. Yeah, it's like, this is what I think it is, but it's not from someone who's lived it.
So I have this, I'm hearing all of you talk, and this is fascinating, because I'm realizing, as I'm listening to this, that while I was growing up watching these movies, I had that privilege of not realizing that this wasn't everyone's life. And I wasn't upper class or upper middle class or anything. I was pretty solidly middle class growing up. But it's that aspirational thing. Like, no one who's middle class thinks that they're middle class. They don't think that they're higher class than they are. And so I saw myself on screen, and what I think John Hughes did, and I don't think it was deliberate, in fact, I'm pretty sure it wasn't, but what I think he did was he provided a space for people like me to look back and say, oh, there's a whole realm of experiences that I do not understand and that I do not know through those absences. And it's only in retrospect that we can do that. Because I'm realizing, listening to all of you, that when I watched Ferris Bueller when it first came out, I was like, this is the coolest movie ever, I want to be Ferris Bueller, I want to dance the Art Institute. But then, when I watched it again as a 20-year-old or a 25-year-old, and I'm in college, and I'm like, why are there no black people in Chicago? And I suddenly was able to put that in perspective. So it actually kind of reflected my own privilege back to me in a way, in a moment in time when the world wasn't really talking about that yet. And I think we've kind of gotten to a point where we are talking about that. So I don't think like John Hughes set out and said, I'm gonna change this young man's life in 1995. But like, he kind of did accidentally in that way.
And to sort of build off of that, we'll start with Kevin here for this question. So you have thoroughly researched the locations where Hughes films were shot, and most were filmed in Chicago and its nearby suburbs. And so, do you think this is what you guys have been saying kind of equals what like impressions people had generally around the country of like middle class suburbia? Do you think this greatly affected how they viewed Chicago? Do you think it really put Chicago more on the map, but maybe not in a completely honest and realistic way? Like how that played into
Where are the
it?
yards?
Yeah.
Where are the houses with the yards?
A little of all of those things. Like, I'm from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and my dad is from Detroit and had a real hang-up about being from the middle of the country. And so whenever something would come along that was based here in the middle of the country, my dad would go to me, that was in pop culture, my dad would, see, like, and John Hughes was one of those things. And I think he was mad that our beloved University of Michigan football team, if they had a successful season, played a game in Pasadena and not in Ann Arbor, even though it's minus 12 degrees and snowing in Ann Arbor, on January 1st. So I grew up with a ton of Midwestern pride, and John Hughes was part of that. I do remember like being that age and thinking it was super cool that all of John Hughes' movies were made in a place that I could get to by car. It was 4 hours away by car. In retrospect, I think researching it and writing a book about it, I think it's fascinating that leading into the 1980s, we largely have a view in cinema of the country as two coasts with nothing in between. Most of the movies that were made by the sort of boy mavericks of the new Hollywood were about New York and Los Angeles. The Martin Scorsese and Paul Schrader mostly on the East Coast, and the Coppolas and John Milius's and Hal Ashby's on the west. And in the middle was not much. John Hughes did not put Chicago on the film on the cinematic map. Let's be clear about that. The Blues Brothers was before John Hughes ever shot 4 years before John Hughes ever shot a foot of film, and My Bodyguard was a teen movie 3 years before John Hughes ever did that, and then Cooley High was even before that in the 1970s, also about Chicago, proudly so. But I would say if those movies opened the door, John Hughes kind of kicked it in. And now it is very commonplace to see films set proudly in Chicago, and I think it's fair to say without John Hughes's influence, we would have had no Love Jones in the 1990s and no romantic comedies like whatever that comedy with the car accident, romance with the car accident and Channing Tatum and Rachel McAdams and what was that called? The Vow, proudly in Chicago, and no. Yeah, exactly, and no Dark Knight. That's kind of the apogee of modern filmmaking in Chicago.
And so I teach some film history classes sometimes, and interestingly, Chicago. We talk about how film kind of starts in New York and then moves to LA, but actually, there's a period of time where Chicago was the central film making center of kind of the universe. It was very early. But yeah, and then again, when you ask people about Chicago who aren't from Chicago, you're most often going to hear Al Capone and kind of gangsters and the Sears Tower, things like that, and Michael Jordan. Okay, and Chicago hot dogs. There's a lot of great things in Chicago, guys. Okay, I get it. Deep dish pizza. But in terms of history, it's most often Al Capone. And the Chicago flag. Lord, there's a lot of stuff, all right? We've got 4 stars on the flag. Okay, the 1893 World's Fair. But John Hughes brought another angle to all of that. So now if you ask people, oh, what do you know about Chicago? Oh, Al Capone. Oh, the Great Chicago Fire, the Chicago Hot Dog, Deep Dish Pizza, what else, guys? And Ferris Bueller, right? So it's brought something else to the city and the kind of environs that changes the way people outside even the country look at kind of what's going on in Chicago.
So I grew up around here, down the street, down the road. I grew up actually in Carpentersville and went to Barrington High during the time when the movies were out, and it really I really feel like it informed a lot of us, and not only how we were going about as high schoolers and middle schoolers, but what caricatures we all were. Who was the Blaine, who was the Ducky, who was the Andy, all those sorts of things. And I really think it just really informed in how we interacted with each other, what we expected from each other, and what assumptions we made of each other. And I definitely felt like there were definitely moments I treated like an Amanda Jones and dated a Blaine and all those sorts of things. And that it gave me categories. And I know it did that for a lot of us.
All right, so I've got more of a technical question here that I will give to you first, Heather, because you do have experience with screenwriting.
Yes.
So John Hughes, it's been said that he wrote some of the scripts within a day or two. And so, Weird Science, 16 Candles, he said those were completed pretty quickly. So how long does a typical screenwriter take to write a film? And was his process unusual? Is this something that you think could be done today when trying to put together a film? Has there been any changes?
Okay, so I was saying earlier, I found a Ferris Bueller script, an early version. I think the expectation we need to set here is that what ends up on film often is not what you start with. So if a writer writes a script, the first draft is going to be, we call it the spew draft, we call it the vomit draft, we call it other drafts, this is going on history, so I won't call them that. But you have a working draft. And I know from the reading that John Hughes, they did a lot of workshopping of his work on the set, like Breakfast Club was an amalgam of several different scripts. If you read the early Ferris Bueller draft, which you can find on script.com, just type up Ferris Bueller script. This I know just from reading it, was an earlier draft. I don't know if it was the first draft, but it is really interesting to read because the movie is there. So a lot of the lines are verbatim that we end up seeing in the movie. I'm 98% certain that this is not what went out to the actors. Or if it did, it was like, here, let's make this movie. And then what ended up getting shot on the set was a version of this. And then what we see is a much more condensed version of this. So, and it's filled with these long monologues and Sloane is a completely different character in how she acts. So there's an evolution of script. The script is the starting point. It is not a blueprint. It is the starting point. And you can see that, yes, this could have been something that was written in 2 to 3 days. He was in advertising. A lot of advertising, the creative process in advertising is throw all the crap out there and then sift through it later, and it's very much what that early script looks like. Typically, a feature script, like if you're working under contract, a month or two, that's 120 pages. In television, when I started in television, and this was 20 years ago, you would get 2 weeks to write a 60-page script, assuming you already had an outline for that. And by the time I left, it was not unheard of to do it in 2 or 3 days, but you were like literally killing yourself to try to get there. So production has definitely shortened, but again, he's kind of being interpreted as he's an auteur who was a genius who just came up with Ferris Buehler, this finished product in 2 or 3 days. And no, it was absolute crap. I guarantee you, whatever it was absolute crap. But some things came through as he reworked it over time.
All right, so we'll talk a bit about the music now that was featured in John Hughes films. So there were songs like If You Leave, Don't You Forget About Me, Twist and Shout. We can pretty much name a song and you can remember which movie or even the scene it was from. How did music play such a vital role in Hughes films, and how do you think that this impacted our culture? Whoever would like to start.
I'll start. I spent a fair amount of time with one of John Hughes' sons in working on this book, and he used to say to me, my dad's favorite part of making the movie was making the soundtrack. He would make the soundtrack so he could make the movie around it, because his favorite part was sifting through his records and reading British music magazines, and getting 45s and cassette tapes in the mail and sifting through them all and figuring out what actually belonged in the movie. I mean, John Hughes did not invent the soundtrack. Saturday Night Fever had sold 80 bazillion copies by the time John Hughes was making movies. Grease and American Graffiti had kind of perfected that model of a soundtrack being a greatest hits album of a bunch of songs from that era. I think what John Hughes did is he made the soundtrack things you hadn't heard before, which was an incredibly prescient idea. A John Hughes soundtrack is sort of the equivalent of a Spotify Discover Weekly playlist now. And so we were all fortunate enough to have his eye to point us towards those songs. And the guys from OMD have said we would not have a career without Pretty Pink. It's that simple. And I think Jim Kerr from Simple Minds has admitted as much too. I had something I wanted to say about this. I think it's I love those movies for the soundtrack. I think it's important to acknowledge that was a very distinct and specific musical point of view at that time. Those were not pop songs that became pop songs because they were in John Hughes movies, and that trajectory from being something that was considered less mainstream to mainstream is the reflection of a very bifurcated musical world at that time, when there was mainstream and there was everything else. That world no longer exists. The internet obliterated that. Now everybody listens to pretty much everything, which is why you never heard a hip-hop song on a John Hughes soundtrack, even though hip-hop was on the ascendancy at the exact same time his movies were also on the ascendancy. So I think they're amazing, and they were pioneering in terms of soundtrack, but they reflect a very specific musical moment that we thankfully are no longer living in.
I think we are, though, because I've noticed, past president, mystery writers of American Midwest, by the way. So in the book world, what you're starting to see is a lot of authors releasing the playlist for their books. I see this more and more as we go on. Authors are either including it with their books, and each chapter has a different song, or you will see them do it on their blog or something like this. Like, this is the playlist I listened to when I was writing this book, and this is like your background, your soundtrack for your book. So now it's a much more interactive experience.
That kind of changed the topic a little bit, but no, it's okay. Well, I actually had a question. I had a question for Kevin. So the movies because I don't know very much about soundtracks, but the movies that you mentioned as having super soundtracks, Saturday Night Fever, American Graffiti, these are movies that are kind of either using contemporary music at a contemporary time, Saturday Night Fever, or taking place in the past and using music from the past, American Graffiti. John Hughes used a lot of music from the past, as well as music from the contemporary era. Was that unusual to use, to go back into the past and say use Twist and Shout and instead of something much more contemporary?
I don't know, but the thing I always thought musically was interesting about his movies is John Hughes was a boomer. You know, John Hughes was born in 1950, and Ferris Bueller, as everybody notices, has a lot of Beatles references to it. Some Kind of Wonderful has a lot of Rolling Stones references to it. The main characters are Amanda, Keith, and Watts. But the soundtracks were all contemporary artists. In fact, when they tried to put together the Ferris Bueller soundtrack, 30 years after the movie was made, they couldn't get the rights to Twist and Shout. It's not, and John Hughes probably could have back then, but he was like, why is anybody going to buy a soundtrack with General Public and the Beatles on? He actually didn't release a soundtrack for Ferris Bueller because he couldn't figure out how all of those songs would fit together. So he thought of the soundtrack as something very cohesive, even though the actual span of music that appears in his movies is far less so.
And when you read Ferris Bueller, you see a lot of the songs. These are mentioned, not even just in dialogue, like Twist and Shout is mentioned, but you see references to songs that Ferris is listening to as he's doing the business of the day, which is not always the case in scripts. So that's not all of it made it into the movie, but it's just an interesting window into what he was like. I think that in the John Hughes mind, there is his characters, and what the characters are listening to was definitely something that influenced how he was writing them.
Just to add on to all of this, because it suddenly occurred to me, this is also the era of MTV. So suddenly you've got these kind of movies that are heavily using soundtracks with montages and these kind of action scenes, for lack of a better word, set to music, coming out at the same time as teenagers are starting to watch this as entertainment on television. And that's kind of blowing up on TV as well and changing what we think of as music and what we think of as popular culture at the time. So these things are going hand in hand.
So when we talk about John Hughes, a lot of times we're talking about his teenage films and the different messages that those had. But while he's known for those, he's also created movies like Home Alone, Uncle Buck, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, among many others. And these feature more adults or just families in general. And so what do you think would be the central message of some of his non-teenage films? Take a moment to think about it.
So I did in my review, I watched Uncle Buck, Curly Sue, and Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, and She's Having a Baby. And my 2020 read on these films are that sometimes, awful people meeting other awful people can sometimes make you not so awful. Because I remembered, especially She's Having a Baby, I remembered in my head it being a sweeter movie than it is, and it is awful. The characters are just awful. Kevin Bacon's character is just mean, yeah. Then Planes, Trains, and Automobiles are just two awful people who are stuck in a very awful situation. And there's just always there's the kick at the end that you're supposed to be like, actually they're really great people. And I'm just like, yeah, actually they're just really awful people who figured out that not to be so horrible. I'm wondering, I think Hughes probably saw himself as a teenager, like the Peter Pan syndrome, right? Never wanted to grow up, resented the fact that he had to grow up and be responsible and do all this, which is ironic given how young he got married and had kids. I kind of, having watched She's Having a Baby, which I ignored when it came out because I was too little, to like, who are they? Adults. I don't want to hear about adults. But I think with that, Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, I know Kevin will want to say that is a great Thanksgiving movie. And it is true. My husband's family religiously watches that every single year. I think it's like adults. The message of most John Hughes movies is adults suck, but also I think that was for the adults going, no one has it figured out. You know what I mean? Like She's Having a Baby, they are just floundering and no one knows what they're doing. Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, like the guy who's got the wife at home and the business trip, he can't get the plane or the car at Lambert either, but the guy who's the big kid has the magic. And adult like Home Alone, the adults leave the kid behind. So adults are still screw-ups, but maybe it's more from an adult's perspective, like we're still big kids trying to figure it out.
Yeah. I always like to give John Hughes credit, particularly in the teen movies, for how well he cast adults. Like the pathos of teenagers is not as meaningful in those movies if you don't have A-plus actors like Harry Dean Stanton and Annie Potts and Paul Dooley playing the adults in those movies. And I think that spirit led him into his movies that were more about adults. I don't think the guys in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles are so awful, but I understand why we'd come to that conclusion. I think that movie is deeply, deeply ironic because it's fundamentally about loneliness, and it takes place on Thanksgiving. It takes place on the day where either none of us are supposed to be lonely or all of us are supposed to be lonely, and it's about two people who find each other. I mean, it sort of folds back on itself, find each other, but also in the midst of discovering how profoundly lonely they both are. That's why I think it's the best. I happen to really like holiday movies too, but it's like the best Thanksgiving movie ever, and I think it's the best Thanksgiving movie ever. I'm Jewish. I don't do Christmas movies, so I definitely see the argument why people love Home Alone at Christmas time, but I don't think it needs Christmas time. Like it doesn't need. I mean,
Die Hard needs Christmas time.
Yeah.
Die Hard needs Christmas.
Yeah, but they could have been leaving town for a summer break and like for a spring break or something, and Home Alone still works.
Yeah,
like
and didn't they? Like they kept leaving him Home Alone.
Yeah, I mean the premise of Home Alone, the premise of Home Alone was like his family was actually headed out on vacation somewhere, and they were like, get in the car and get ready to go to the airport. And John Hughes was like, hang on 1 second. He ran in the house and wrote down on a notepad, what if we left one kid behind? And promptly forgot about it and got back into the car and off they went. When he came home, he saw that idea and was like, oh, there's Home Alone. But I don't even remember the question, but adults. Okay, I've talked enough. Someone else go.
I've been pondering this, and I haven't seen She's Having a Baby in a very, very long time. I may not have actually ever seen it. Not the thing to admit on a John Hughes panel, but to me, the movies about teens, John Hughes movies about teens, are ultimately somewhat hopeful. And the movies about adults, I wouldn't say that they're not hopeful. I'd say that they're more about that feeling of just general sadness you get for your missed youth, or the loneliness kind of ties into that, and these are all bad people kind of ties into that. But it's this idea, this pathos, right? At the end of the movie, there's always a gut punch. There's always like, oh, my wife's been dead the whole time. And you're just like, man, like this was really funny for a while and now it's not. And that's kind of life too. And so when you're a teenager, you look at life as, everything's gonna work out great. And as an adult, you kind of realize that doesn't always happen.
All right, so we are in a new decade now, the 2020s, which means that over the next several years, a lot of these John Hughes films are going to be reaching their 40th anniversaries. And so how do you think audiences will view these movies in another, we'll say 60, 70 years from now? Compared to how we view them now.
So, a couple of things taking from, so we both have college students. I also have preteens in my house. I'm just thinking of how college students today watch Friends a lot, and they love Friends. And I keep going, why? It's not, well, it's not that old, but it's also not, I'm sorry, not as good as, it's not, like, I have other things that you could watch that are so much better, like, please. Also, when Stranger Things came out, so that was, what, 5 years ago? Yeah, and all, like, it was really weird, because all of the people our age were like, it's the best thing ever! And I was like, okay, because nostalgia. And then all the late teens, early 20-somethings were like, this is a great show. And I'm like, why? What is it that you're seeing? Because I know why we're watching it, but what is resonating with you? And I never really got an answer to that. So like in the realm of, we are the first generation, or we are, but our kids are, that have access to the entire entertainment catalog. All of it, the media. So it used to be, like when we were younger, our parents would talk about a movie that was great, and maybe it would come on cable. This is before video. Some of you remember before video. You know, like, oh, we have to watch Charlie Brown Christmas at Christmas. Charlie Brown Christmas, or Charlie Brown Thanksgiving. You had to be at home. Yes, the little known Charlie Brown Hanukkah. At home on the night. And if you missed it till next year. So there, I think people, like kids, will continue to dip into it as it's the 80s, it's the early 90s, but it doesn't resonate with kids in the same way. These are like the historical document. I made my kids watch Vacation, Pretty in Pink, my daughter watched. That was really educational because like, do not ever let anyone do this to you. Breakfast Club, we were already Ferris Bueller fans. So it's interesting that they do see how life is different in their relationships versus our relationships. But aside from the Vacation movie where my 13-year-old boy was laughing during some of it and we had to explain the whole marijuana thing. Sure. It just doesn't, there's not much there for them. And honestly, like I don't have a fond memory of it because it didn't really ever speak to me either. There was nothing there for me except Ferris Bueller, which was a fun, really good movie. I was Jeannie, so my parents told me. There's not much there, so I think it's, as historical, it's relevant as a starting point for what the teen movie genre was. But I don't know if it's going to continue to, like, people are going to do special screenings like The Godfather and have it be the same, like, effect of this was really a good movie. My opinion. Did your kid watch? Has she seen?
I think we tried to have her watch Ferris Bueller, and she got bored. Yeah, it just did.
She just wandered off.
So, yeah, but my daughter also just doesn't like a lot of movies, so she's not a movie person. She likes to just stream TV shows.
No.
So.
No, kids today do not watch television. They do not watch television. They will watch movies if they're interested, but everything comes through the computer now. It is a fundamental shift in how people are digesting media these days, and it's YouTube. It's not network. Well, how many of us watch network, right?
Right. No.
But yeah. So, but did she? Is there anything in there that she's like, oh yeah?
No, not anything in the John Hughes realm. No. Yeah, like she just watches. She watches a lot of like early odd TV on Hulu and Netflix, but then she just lets it run and run. So it's almost like a movie. She'll like just watch 3 or 4.
Yeah. Oh
episodes.
yeah, binge watching.
Binge
The
watching,
kids discover
yes.
I'm binging, Mom. Like that's very nice.
But she just always has it on in the background. So
Yeah.
like, you know, like I remember when I was her age, I just had MTV on in the background while I did my homework, and she has Vampire Diaries or Gossip Girl, that kind of thing.
I don't know. It's a very wide, it's a very specific viewpoint that I don't know if that is of paramount interest to today's audiences, general audiences, if that makes sense.
You have a thought on this.
Little one, a very small thought. So there's this sort of layer of the atmosphere in culture called classics. And I usually refer to those things as things that transcend the moment in time that they come from. So yes, The Great Gatsby feels very much like 1925, but it also feels like for all time. Granted, it only got to that point in the 1940s. Like, Great Gatsby was a bomb in its day. It took a long time for it to become that, but now it's that. I think John Hughes directed 8 films. 2 of 8 of them are in the Library of Congress. And so Ferris Bueller's Day Off and The Breakfast Club are in the National Film Registry next to The Wizard of Oz and Casablanca and Citizen Kane. So our culture considers all of those movies equally important if that registry means anything to you. However, like above this layer in the atmosphere known as classics is, I don't know, super classics maybe? I mean, are things that were hits in their day and have never gone out of style. Like, the Beatles had some phenomenally successful contemporaries who we barely think about today. But the Beatles, the Rolling Stones, and a few other acts from that era have somehow maintained their afterburn all the way up here until the present. I mean, listen, ABBA has sold only the Beatles have sold more records than ABBA. But I think if you ask one of your kids, who's ABBA, they'll say, oh, those Swedish people? I mean, what will they say? Or they'll say, or you have to sing Dancing Queen, right?
Mamma Mia.
Right, Mamma Mia. But
Yeah.
yes, I'm glad you said that, because basically to have something go from the classic level to the super classic level, you need something to kind of wrench it into the present. You need Mamma Mia. You will need someone on some streaming TV show in 2029 to talk about how great Some Kind of Wonderful is, to wrench it from 1987 to the present.
Yes, but with today, with the fact that our kids are not, like, it used to be, you got your media, you got it on the television with your 4 channels, and I'm including PBS. You got your movies from the local cinema as long as it ran, so that's why Star Wars was in theaters for what?
2 years.
2 years, and people would go and watch it, like pay to watch it 10 different times. You had your local radio station, you had your records, your vinyl. That is how you got your media. And what you were, and the water cooler, so this water cooler concept. The movie came out, and you would talk about the next day, or Who Shot JR? You would talk about the next day. That is gone for most media. Now, stuff will rise up like Stranger Things, but there is so much delusion of the popular culture, and again, we have access to everything backwards as well as current. What is a larger question, but what are the super classics going to look like given how many different streams we have to consume media? This is a pop culture question, I think.
Yeah. So I'm gonna disagree a little bit, because I think there are still some touchstones that if you go and see the newest Marvel movie, there is a statute of limitations on your spoilers.
Right.
And I think anything that has spoilers attached to it are part of the contemporary must-see. That's our water cooler moment, right? Have you seen Stranger Things season 3 yet? Well, I can't tell you anything about it.
Right.
The withholding of information, because we live in an information glut. But this idea that I think the fact that we have this information glut, we will always have Ferris Bueller streaming somewhere, means that it's never going to go away. And it's gonna be a classic, and it's gonna be a super classic, and then it's gonna be loathed. And then for 10 years, people are gonna say this is the worst movie ever made. And then 10 years later, it's gonna be reevaluated again. I think once something enters into the population, or enters into a culture, it never goes away. What happens is the culture itself kind of changes. And so what once was maybe seen by 10 million people is now seen by 1 million people. But those 1 million people all have Twitter, and they all go talk about it on Twitter. And then the 5,000 people that are following that hashtag suddenly form a group, and that group decides we're gonna do a massive screening of Ferris Bueller's Day Off, and it's gonna become, so it kind of it moves and changes through culture in ways that we can't foresee. But I don't think it's ever going to disappear, and I don't think it's ever going to become something that is forgotten.
No. And I think it's important to remember that Ferris Bueller has been wildly popular since the day it was born.
Yeah.
Ferris Bueller never had a moment where people stopped caring about it. It was not forgotten about and then rediscovered again. It's like, so feeling nostalgic for Ferris Bueller is like feeling nostalgic for like oxygen. It's like it's sort of always been here. Now, you can say that about, there are certain movies from that time that we did forget about and are reevaluating. I suggest we reevaluate Streets of Fire once a year. Like, that's how deeply I feel about Streets of Fire. But yeah, I think in the act of talking about something from the past, it's culture from the past, it's very important to look at those hard numbers and say, what actually did go through these ebbs and flows, and what has just been like a rocket to the moon, you know, since the day of its takeoff.
Well, and it's gonna get remixed, and it's gonna get reformed in all sorts of ways, and we've already seen it. Like, we've seen The Breakfast Club in like 4 different versions. And we've seen kind of these iconic images of Ferris Bueller being reproduced over and over again, and their meanings change every time they're reproduced. So we may never see Ferris Bueller in the way that Ferris Bueller originally came out, and we're never going to see The Breakfast Club in the way it came out. But your grandchildren, one day, are going to see a version of Ferris Bueller that you can't even dream of. Ferris Bueller in VR. Right? Like the virtual reality of Ferris Bueller, and that's going to be for them Ferris Bueller.
Yeah.
And that's I think the staying power of things that are classic, right? Is that it's not that they stay the same, it's they change, and that's what's wonderful about them.
No, I mean, that's good. I'm not saying John Hughes will, like, bad you. But I'm saying he is, like, the artist, John Hughes. He's going to be remembered for Ferris Bueller. He's going to be remembered for Planes, Trains, on. Like, his very good quality stuff definitely deserves to be classics. Because, like, that was when my kids are very cinematic, because we, like, early on, we didn't do the whole Nickelodeon stuff. We're like, you were watching Godfather, gosh darn it, and Terminator.
Age 6.
Terminator and Ferris Bueller. They didn't understand Ferris Bueller. We got to go back. But I mean, it is foundational. This is where you get your references. This is, I mean, if you have Twist and Shout, that will always be a parade scene. I think for most people who've seen that. Yeah. So someone needs to redo Pretty in Pink, and with Hollywood cultures, Hollywood loves an IP. So they will always remake something before they do anything new. Always, especially now. So maybe that's how he becomes more relevant in the future, is someone takes it and makes a version of it that's much more reflective of our culture today.
Yeah, indeed. Don't give our
I do think, though, that he's still been, I think if somebody really digs in, his movies can really be this touchstone of how the late 80s, early 90s was this little tipping point space for these class, gender conversations. I mean, like Some Kind of Wonderful is basically about slut shaming, and easy girls, and what do you do with them, and the class conflict within that. How do you use your body to gain advantage in society? And he went so far with, again, this is one of those things I'm really, I love that movie, but I'm also frustrated at how short he came to really making it a classic.
So, does Some Kind of Wonderful become Easy A, like in an ideal, in a perfect world?
Easy A, I was saying here, like, Easy A is brilliant.
Yeah.
And I think, and that's where we're talking about, it as an inspiration for something better. That's probably where John Hughes will start to fit in. Because again, we've got to go back to what the culture was at the time. We did not have what we have now, and I think people forget that. This is what was available at the time, so this is what people latched onto. We had MTV. You talked about the malls, like the spending power, the new spending power that we had. It was a reflection of the culture at the time, so it's going to change now to serve the culture that we have.
And not only that, you could just see him grasping for something and just coming up short.
Yeah, he didn't have the
Yeah,
language.
right. Yeah.
But how many, like, I grew up in a very black, I grew up in Ferguson. Have you heard of it? So, but that wasn't everyone's reality, right? Where you grew up like American and like everyone was a type. Like we didn't even have the whole version of types at my high school. So that's yeah, I was like, we wouldn't even be, we would have to go outside to cast half our people. We had a ducky, but that was, so it's like, I think we're now seeing like our kids versus us. We had to go to the movies to see the other realities. Because unless you were traveling outside your little town, you weren't meeting a whole lot of different people. And I think that's what John Hughes was, is he was in his bubble, but he really didn't have the ability. It would be interesting to see if he were working now. Was what he was doing with his viewpoint, would that have reflected more of the society at the time?
All right, so now I want to take some time to open up the discussion to the audience. If anyone has any questions, Mike over here in the back has a microphone to bring over to make sure we can hear the question, and we have one over here.
Hi. My question is focusing on the movies Planes, Trains, and Automobiles and Uncle Buck. First up, I see Uncle Buck showing up on one of my cable stations monthly. And every time it's on, I watch it. And I think his casting in those two movies were spectacular with John Candy and Steve Martin. And I was just wondering if he had cast those actors in those parts, do you feel the movies would have been as successful as they were? Because John Candy carries Uncle Buck. That whole movie is on his shoulders. And I couldn't think of a better comedy tandem in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles than Steve Martin and John Candy. So I just wanted to open up that panel.
I don't know, but John Candy is Uncle Buck, and I love John Candy movies. I mean, like, I can't imagine. Yeah, I probably watched most of them growing up, and Uncle Buck was always one of my favorites, and he was just perfect in that movie as, you know, the man who didn't grow up, Peter Pan. Is it Amy Madigan? Yeah. Has his girlfriend, the kids are perfect. I really think that movie is just really perfect.
I mean, John Hughes said that Steve Martin and John Candy in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles are effectively playing themselves, which means that John Candy in Uncle Buck is not playing himself. Uncle Buck is a very different character than Del Griffith. And I think we see in Planes, Trains, and Automobiles, which was 2 years before Uncle Buck, that John Candy is a spectacular actor, not just a funny person. We see, I mean, the most important scenes in that movie is actually when he's not being funny, when he's being serious. So John Candy, I think mostly because of his stature and size, and because of his training in Second City in Toronto, was largely cast in like funny fat guy roles. But I think given that bit of historical knowledge that Del Griffith is John Candy, we look at everything John Candy did from that point forward to his death, and we realize that John Candy really had quite a bit of range, even though the movies he was cast in didn't always offer him that opportunity.
And as an aside, it's not John Candy, but reading that early Ferris Bueller script as well, there's an ongoing debate as to whether Ferris Bueller is a sociopath or not. He's clearly a sociopath in the early version. It does some really mean things, and I don't know how much of that, what we ended up seeing was a reflection of Matthew Broderick's casting. I don't see Matthew Broderick as a mean character. I'm trying to think if he's ever done a mean election.
Yeah.
But that was passive. That was impotent rage, I think. But he wasn't like going out to be mean just to be mean, just because he could. In the script, the early script, he was. So I think like the reason Ferris Bueller was so successful was because of the casting of Ferris and Cameron. And those two actors gave it this kindness and this humanity that it really needed to balance out the rest. And then they cut out the jerk stuff. That helped. I mean, I wonder about Sloane casting me as Sarah, because that role got great. Like watching it, she's just kind of in the background a lot. she was much more vocal and much more active and much more, you're being a jerk, Ferris. So I'm wondering how much of that was she was a young actress who was maybe more inexperienced and they had to cut lines, or they just wrote her different, like they did a rewrite differently because she was like much more unattainable and gorgeous. So it's always an interesting thing when you get actors cast, how scripts will change and your vision for the characters will change as it comes to the mouths of those people, and they bring their humanity to whatever the role is.
I don't really have anything else to say except I've been thinking of Plane, Trains, and Automobiles. I've been thinking of Uncle Buck, and I've been thinking of those roles. And to your question, I can't think of anyone else in those roles. And that's maybe the short answer, is like they're so indelibly associated with those roles that just to even try and picture it doesn't work.
There was a question over here, but I can't reach, so I'll just repeat the question once it's asked.
Sir, in the tan jacket?
Yeah. When I first looked at the topic here, was going to be how John Hughes changed society. Wasn't that the original one? And, I was thinking about how they changed the view of teenagers, and my big teenage one was Ferris Bueller and Rebel Without a Cause. Now, Rebel Without a Cause is in a nostalgic time when people were all nostalgic, and Ferris Bueller is in a time was somewhat turbulent. And I was thinking the fact that Hughes portrays teenagers differently, has that changed the view of teenagers in America, or the way we look at humor in America?
We'll translate.
Yeah. I got another one.
No, that's.
So if anyone can hear that, if I understood your question, it's John Hughes is portraying teenagers kind of in the 1980s and 1990s, and that's different from the portrayal of teenagers in, say, the 1950s and 60s, where they're kind of much more rebellious in some ways, much more angry, and in the 80s we're seeing kind of John Hughes teenagers being, I think, a little bit rebellious, but rebellious within the line, right? They're coloring within the lines, but they're using really strong colors, right? And your question was about whether that changed what we're looking at today in terms of teenagers?
Yeah, or since he made those movies, have the view of teenagers changed, or has the making of those movies changed our ideas about what teenagers really are thinking?
Yes. I mean, the view of teenager, anytime you're going to have representations on screen is going to change what people think of those types of people, what's being represented. And so, yeah, but I think it goes back to what Kevin was saying all the way at the beginning, right? These are preteens watching teenagers and thinking, this is what being a teenager is going to be like. And then they get there and it's not quite that, but media has also changed. And so then the view of teenagers we get in like the late 90s is much more safe and I think a lot more romantic in a lot of ways. You start seeing like She's All That, and I'm trying to think of these other kind of romantic, do you have a list? Clueless, Freaky Friday, Juno, oh, well that's maybe a little later.
That was a little later. Save the Last Dance. Oh, that was the Zeros. Yeah. Clueless was the big one because I didn't like the 90s. But She's All That. What was the one? There was the gender switching one. The
Freaky Friday?
no, that was the mom switching one. No, there was the girl who was pretending to be a guy to. Thank you. I watched it like 8 million times.
Yeah,
It was an 80s film.
86, 87.
It's all a blur.
Like, it was the Shakespeare movies and the Jane Austen movies in the 90s, so 10 things I hate.
Okay, yes, 10 Things I Hate About You.
Right.
I was trying to be a 20-something in the 90s, so I was too old for these movies.
Yeah, but could they make them in the 50s and 60s?
So what I'm hearing is another question, which I think is
Same thing.
interesting, is did it change adults' view of teenagers at the time? I'm trying to think of because my mom and her best friend took me and her daughter to see Ferris Bueller, and I wasn't old enough yet, and they really loved it, and I think because they could turn around and say, see, Charlie Sheen is telling Jeannie to just not worry about her brother. So I think that maybe that could be an interesting, I don't know, we weren't adults then. So were there any adults in your lives who were like, yeah, now we're seeing this different version of teenagers?
Just a little history, just like a teaspoon of history. A Rebel Without a Cause was not made for teenagers. Rebel Without a Cause was made for adults to warn them about teenagers. In fact, the title Rebel Without a Cause came from a book about psychopathology, and it was like, they treated being an adolescent like a disease. Very few movies about teenagers were made for teenagers until John Hughes and his immediate predecessors.
Blackboard Jungle.
Blackboard Jungle was made for grown-ups. For grown-ups to warn them about dangerous teenagers. You read the editorials about Blackboard Jungle, it was like, thank God we know what teenagers are up to. It was, accidentally teenagers watched those movies.
The movie 13.
Yeah.
When that came out, it scared the crap out of me.
Yeah, and that was like
Yes,
2002 or something
yeah,
like that. Yeah,
yeah.
I mean, that movie wouldn't have been possible without John Hughes. So John Hughes paved the way for all of those. And to be fair, Breaking Away and Fame and The Warriors and several movies about teenagers kind of paved the way for John Hughes. He was not sui generis, but we are living in the world that he created.
Got a question there?
Why do you feel John Hughes came back to the North Shore to make his movies and not in Hollywood?
Oh, I can make sense. All right. So I grew up in the Midwest, but I'm actually a native of Evanston. And I lived in LA for 14 years. And Hollywood is everything that you think it is, it is. I remember very distinctly, having grown up in St. Louis, coming back to Chicago too. I went to Northwestern, so stepping out of the car after doing a whole East Coast college tour, stepping out of the car on the campus of Northwestern going, I belong here. This is home. So I mean, I don't know, for other people, Chicago feels like my place. This is my home, independent of the food and the fire and alcohol. Geographically, this is the place. And being able to move back here as an adult, because my husband got a job here, because every time I would see Chicago in a movie or, oh my God, I want to be back there. I mean, it is a longing. Hollywood is a very transitory place. Everyone there is from somewhere else. You can speak to this too, because you live out there now. They're Midwesterners in LA. They can never get where we're from, so everyone thought I was from Iowa. I'm like, dude, Missouri, it's not that hard. Flyover, they still say flyover states. They still have the same view of the nothingness that is the Midwest. They see it as inferior. They mean, not everybody. Hollywood is, I left behind wonderful people in Hollywood, but it gets in your mind, and even your dentist has a screenplay. It's a very, I'm not kidding. We came back for a family wedding, and I sat in Giordano's and said, look, that guy over there, he's a plumber, and that's probably all he is. He is a plumber, and then he goes home to his kids, and he wakes up the next day, and he's still just a plumber, and that's great. There is such a hustle to living in Los Angeles. You always have to be on, you always have to be producing, you always have to be doing something, you always have to be, it's like you're a one-person marketing thing. It is exhausting. It is exhausting and soul-sucking, and I say working there, and I still have friends who live there, but it's hard. And I can very much see that he didn't want to take his kids there. I'm so glad that I'm not raising my kids there, because I know exactly how hard it would be to raise my two kids there and have them have the expectation of life that I need them to have, if that makes any sense. It's a strange upside down world that doesn't follow logic. The industry of Hollywood. So yeah, I very much don't question his, I don't want to be there, don't make me go there. And the minute he did, he kind of tried to play the game and be that person. And because it rubs off on you too. You have to adapt to your surroundings. But yeah, the minute he comes home, I believe it. Because I was like that too.
Right there?
Okay.
I was just interested in the relationship between a filmmaker and the geography, being rooted in a place, identifying someone like John Hughes and North Shore, and you mentioned different filmmakers, and growing up, I always identified Woody Allen with New York, Scorsese with New York, Spike Lee with New York, and I grew up in Texas. I never saw representations of Texas, except for like terms of endearment,
Friday Night Lights.
or later the movie Rushmore. You know, so I'm just kind of curious about the relation between the filmmaker and being rooted in a real place, or at least an imagined real place, as opposed to kind of an anonymous, generic place that you might see in a lot of movies. That relationship.
I mean, when I think about the geography, I think that, I mean, like, because I said, I grew up just outside of this space and in that time space, and these movies are, he loves the space. He loves this geography. He loves Chicago. He loves the suburbs. He has issues with the suburbs, and all that comes up, and that's what he's exploring in these movies. And you can see that he just loves the Midwest and Chicago, and I think that that's what drew me to those films as well, is that growing up in the suburbs of Chicago, this is why you travel anywhere, and you're like, where are you from? Chicago. Or where are you really from? Well, Naperville. That kind of thing. Because Chicago, you're rooted in Chicago. These movies are rooted in Chicago, and they're love letters. And sometimes you bring out complications with the people you love.
There's sort of no such thing as a filmmaker who doesn't sort of repeat themselves. There's no such thing as a filmmaker who makes a totally different movie every time. You'll always see themes and continuities between them. And sometimes those continuities are places, like they are with the filmmakers you named. For Texas filmmakers, I always throw in Richard Linklater, because Dazed and Confused is the reason I went to graduate school in Austin. Like, granted, that movie was set in 1975, and I wasn't going to 76, and I wasn't going to graduate school in 1976. But the first year I was there, everybody who came to visit me was like, we got to go to Top Shelf Burgers. We got to go where the moon towers are. We got to do, yeah, that movie put Austin on the map. But some filmmakers, the continuity is in theme. Ed Zwick is a great Chicago filmmaker. As far as I know, has made one movie in Chicago about last night. But what Ed Zwick likes to do is make big movies with big personalities. That's why there's always huge movie stars in Ed Zwick's movies. He's kind of an old Hollywood guy. Big faces, big personalities. Those are his continuity.
But that's his film. His television is very internal.
Yeah.
Once and Again, 30-something is very centered in
It is
the
very
Chicago
like,
suburbs.
old-fashioned idea of like a big screen and a small screen.
Right,
Like, yeah.
because he writes Chicago suburbs.
Yeah,
Like,
on TV.
Yeah,
Like,
that's where his people are living, is Chicago, the fictional Chicago area.
yeah, so I think it just depends on where a filmmaker derives their artistic mojo from. Some people it's places, and some people it's something more abstract than that.
But if you think of Ferris Bueller too, like the geography of Chicago, we were talking about all these movies, is very much divided between the city and not the city.
Yeah.
And you have to do a journey to get to the city. And it's going to be completely different from what you know in the suburbs. This is not an easy journey to make, but the reason a lot of us live by a train line, we like to go there fairly conveniently without driving all day. That would not be the same movie in like Missouri, where you drive everywhere.
Yeah.
Or like most of the Midwest, you drive to get to everywhere, and you don't have teenagers who drive a lot. So I think that enables us to have those types of stories coming up and be rooted in these very specific types of areas.
I think we have time for one more question. We got over here. Oh, we got him here, and then we can take one more. There we go.
I knew John Hughes fairly well. He was not a great friend, but I knew him fairly well. I knew his wife better than I do. And I can second the motion on the Hollywood thing. She hated Hollywood. She would not have her kids. That's why they built the house in Glencoe, and they moved there. And I have 100 stories, because he'd come back, he'd make a movie, he'd come back to Northbrook, because her parents still lived here. So I would see him, I worked at Sunset over here, so I'd see him all the time, and we would talk, and I'd buttonhole him, and I'd grab him on the side. There's some great stories on planes, trains, and automobiles. John Candy was his best friend. And one story he told me about that movie, he said, Steve Martin told him, you see that scene where he goes crazy in the parking lot? He told me, he says, John, I'm going to give you one take. That's it. I'm giving you everything I got. If you don't get it, it's too bad. I'm walking away. And that's what happened, he did it in one take.
That's amazing. Thank you for sharing.
All right, so you had a question over here?
Yeah, I can't recall the specific name of the film, but it starred Rodney Dangerfield and Bill Murray on a golf course, and they were
Caddyshack.
Caddyshack.
Caddyshack. And the scene with the child, throwing the baby Ruth into the pool is the most hilarious scene I've ever seen. How would you compare those kids to a John Hughes kid?
I'll just tell you, I have crashed the Boca
Microphone.
Raton. I have crashed the Boca Raton Country Club just to, because my parents live down the street from it in the wintertime. I've crashed that country club just to pretend like it was brushwood and throw shit in the pool if I've never done that, but I've thought about it.
Okay, but,
Veronica, have you seen Caddyshack?
not forever.
Do you have a
Yeah.
relationship with Caddyshack? I
No, I
think
have
this is
no
one.
relationship
This
with
is one of those male movies.
Oh, it's so.
Yeah. This is the Three Stooges. This is Vacation. This is like, let's get back to who John Hughes. Okay, that's fine. But I'm talking about like the point of view.
Yeah.
It is there's something about Mary.
Uh-huh.
Where I watched that movie and I was like, okay, I know everything I need to know about the male mind, and I don't like what I'm seeing.
So true.
I just wanted to double check my thinking. Thank you. All right. Okay, we have one more in the back, and then we'll be done.
I'll say this loud. Since John Hughes used Chicago and the suburbs as his location, do you know if he was involved in the actual site selection?
Should I?
This is all you,
Oh,
man.
yeah, I'm sorry, I don't want to.
You're the
resident expert.
I did talk to, actually, at this library, right, Mike? Like, the first time we did this in 2016, we got Billy Higgins, who was his location manager, to, and I didn't have to do anything. I just kind of pointed at him, and he went, so, 16 candles, and then he would roll for 50 minutes. It was awesome for me. So yes, he had a guy named Billy Higgins who would scout sites here around the North Shore. But and Billy mostly, because this was before digital photography, Billy would shoot like 30 rolls of film in a day and then drop them off at the 1-hour photo processing plant spot, and then he would pick them up and then he would spend all night pinning them up on cardboard, and then they would meet at the Northbrook Diner in the morning for breakfast, and Billy would pull out these large sheets of cardboard with photos on them, and Mr. Hughes would decide based on that where the movie should be. And what Billy said was he was very clear on the slight architectural differences and looks between the different parts of the North Shore. So he would photograph a church for the end of 16 Candles, Billy would, and John Hughes would say, 2 Kenilworth, not enough Glencoe. And he would say, okay, and he would go and he'd find a church in Glencoe, and then he would. So that's how well he knew the terrain. He also had a very diligent location manager who did the pre-selecting for him.
I have a question on that.
Yeah.
But so then he never, like, so one of the things I think about being in Chicago and loving those films and watching them is like, especially the ride into Chicago and Ferris Bueller, you're like, that is not how it happened.
Totally, that's not it.
This is
You're going
not
the
the
wrong
right,
way.
you're going the wrong way, and so much. It's like the Bob Newhart opening scene. Like, it takes him forever to get somewhere, but so, yeah.
Sometimes I wonder if they did that ride just so they could get the shot down Clark of downtown. Yeah, like, but on the one hand, it's like that big city montage. Chicago's never looked better. Like, it is stunning. And then on the other hand, I hear from natives who grew up here. They're like, what town is that? And how do you? And what route are you taking? Yeah, it is no logical way anybody would actually get into the loop.
The Netflix series where they showed, just a side note, that they had a thing, I saw it around Thanksgiving, filming at New Trier West. I don't know if you guys saw it, so for people here, it's a great thing to do.
The movies that made us, is that the series you're
Uncle
talking
thing
about?
They did they created the studio in the empty school, in the gyms, for Uncle Buck and a few of the other movies. And it's on Netflix, it's great to watch.
The movies that made us.
Yeah.
All right, well, that's about all the time we have for tonight. Thank you all for attending. Thank you, Veronica, Kevin, Heather, Paul. Great talking to you guys. Have a good night, everyone.